Ladies and gentlemen, I didn't plan to end up in the hospital. No one ever does. You don't schedule collapse into your calendar. You don't pencil in neural malfunction between meetings and milestones. You tell yourself you're fine, that the data will hold, the brain will adjust, and that your limits are only parameters to be optimized. But the human body is not a machine. It pretends to be one until the moment it can't. I remember the sterile light first, the faint hum of the MRI scanner, the soft pulse of a monitor that seemed to mock the rhythm I'd ignored in myself for years. My heart wasn't broken, not in the poetic sense, not even medically. It was something far quieter, a system overclocked, a nervous system fraying under the illusion of control. For months before that day, I had been living in what neuroscientists call hyperarousal, the state where the sympathetic nervous system, responsible for our fight or flight responses, never truly shuts off. It's the survival mode of modern success. I'd convinced myself that sleepless nights were a badge of honor, that fatigue was a cost of innovation. I told myself I was contributing to something larger than rest. But the truth is, even the most brilliant brain cannot escape biology. There's a paradox I want to share, one I ignored for too long. The human brain, at its core, is a prediction machine. It tries to minimize uncertainty, to control outcomes, to forecast chaos. That's what makes us innovators. But when you push that mechanism beyond recovery, when you feed it with caffeine instead of compassion, it starts turning against you. Your neurotransmitters rebel, dopamine becomes distorted, cortisol becomes your silent companion. You no longer live in time, you survive in it. In my case, it began subtly. I would wake up already anxious, as if my mind had been running simulations all night. My dreams weren't dreams anymore. They were problem-solving algorithms. I'd eat only because logic told me to, not hunger. My conversations grew shorter, my empathy dulled. I had entered what neuroscientists describe as allostatic overload, when the cost of maintaining stability becomes greater than the stability itself. And then, one morning, I simply couldn't stand up. The body had drawn its final boundary. When I woke up in that hospital bed, a nurse was adjusting the IV line. My mind wanted to analyze her technique, to dissect every motion, but something in me had gone still. There was an unfamiliar silence, like the system had rebooted into safe mode. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking, I was just existing. And in that stillness, I realized something profound. The mind's need to control is the very thing that disconnects it from life. Science has long shown that the brain and body are not separate entities. They are one feedback loop. Every thought changes the chemistry of the body. Every heartbeat sends data back to the brain. The hospital, strangely, became the perfect lab. I watched my vitals fluctuate with each emotion, each memory, each attempt to understand what went wrong. I saw in real time how self-criticism spiked my blood pressure and how forgiveness lowered it. This wasn't metaphorical, it was measurable. That realization began to reshape my view of intelligence itself. For decades, we've defined intelligence as speed, precision, output, the ability to compute. But nature doesn't reward speed, it rewards balance, and a tree doesn't rush its growth. The human brain evolved not to move faster than others, but to connect deeper, to sustain. Yet, in our age of relentless acceleration, we've mistaken movement for progress. I had spent years studying neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to change. What I had forgotten was that plasticity has a cost. Every adaptation consumes energy. Every new demand creates stress. The cortex expands, but the organism contracts. You can't keep reprogramming the system without letting it rest. Neuroplasticity, without restoration, becomes neurodegeneration. And that's where I found myself, a mind brilliant enough to model the future, but too stubborn to inhabit the present. As I lay in that hospital bed, I started mapping my own recovery like a scientific project. I monitored my brain waves, my cortisol curves, my heart rate variability, but I also began something more radical. I allowed myself to feel. For someone who had lived in logic, that was terrifying. I learned that emotion isn't noise, it's data. Every tear, every tremor, every burst of joy is the nervous system's way of communicating in a language older than words. And I learned this not in the lab, not in the pages of a journal, but in a hospital room where the most sophisticated technology couldn't save me from the consequences of ignoring my own design. I remember the first sunrise I saw after being discharged. It wasn't extraordinary by any cosmic standard, no dramatic clouds, no divine beam of light. But for the first time, I truly saw it. The colors weren't just photons hitting retinal cells. They were frequencies translating directly into emotion. The brain wasn't analyzing, it was receiving. That moment taught me something no textbook ever did. Awareness itself is healing. When the mind stops dissecting and starts perceiving, energy returns to coherence. In the weeks that followed, I began journaling what I called neural sensations. Subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in thought that had corresponding changes in the body. A single anxious thought could tighten my chest. One moment of gratitude could lower my pulse. This wasn't spiritual, it was physiological. The vagus nerve, which connects the brain to nearly every organ, was the bridge. It was proof that emotion isn't something we feel in the mind, it's something the entire body experiences. When we ignore that connection, we become machines trying to run emotional software without hardware support. In neuroscience, there's a concept called interoception, the brain's ability to sense the internal state of the body. It's what allows you to know you're hungry, tired, or anxious even before your conscious mind labels it. The more tuned your interoceptive awareness, the more emotionally intelligent you become. And here's the paradox: the smarter we become as a species, the more disconnected we get from this ancient intelligence. We know the universe and equations, yet fail to feel our own pulse. The hospital was my forced reconnection. Each heartbeat became data, each breath an experiment. I started seeing the human body not as a vessel, but as an interface, a living feedback system between consciousness and creation. When that system is ignored, reality distorts. Decisions become reactive, relationships transactional, innovation obsessive. We start creating from fear instead of inspiration. That's what I had done for years. Chase brilliance while abandoning balance. There's a myth in science and business that genius is supposed to hurt, that suffering somehow validates greatness. But suffering is not a badge of intellect, it's a signal of imbalance. Every breakdown carries within it an encrypted message. You've drifted too far from coherence. When decoded correctly, it becomes wisdom. When ignored, it becomes disease. I began to view my hospital stay not as a collapse, but as a correction, the nervous system's last, desperate attempt to restore truth. It had been speaking to me for years through fatigue, irritability, and anxiety. I had dismissed each message as weakness. I know now that the body never lies. It will whisper at first, then speak, then scream, and if you still don't listen, it will stop you. Mine did. During rehabilitation, I restructured everything, my schedule, my diet, even my relationship with ambition. I began using neurofeedback technology that mirrors your brainwaves back to you in real time to retrain my nervous system toward balance. It was humbling. The same brain that once calculated theoretical models of consciousness now struggled to maintain a steady alpha rhythm. But slowly, with patience, it began to sink. My prefrontal cortex quieted, my heart rate stabilized, the anxiety that once felt like a background operating system began to dissolve. And then came something unexpected: creativity, pure, unforced, effortless creativity. Not the kind that's squeezed from caffeine and deadlines, but the kind that flows when the mind and body are in harmony. In that state, I noticed how easily ideas connected, how empathy returned, how even the simplest human interaction felt meaningful. Again, it was as if my consciousness had been rebooted into its natural architecture. I realized then that innovation at its deepest level is not about pushing harder, it's about tuning finer. The greatest minds in history, from Da Vinci to Tesla, were not merely thinkers. They were feelers. They listened to subtle patterns that others ignored. They weren't chasing success. They were following resonance. When you align your mind and body, the world itself begins to organize around you, not magically, but biologically. coherence attracts coherence. One afternoon during a research session, I measured the brain activity of two individuals deeply connecting conversation. To my surprise, their brainwaves began to synchronize. Their neural oscillations literally mirrored each other. That's empathy in measurable form, two nervous systems aligning through presence. The implications of that are profound. It means that healing, innovation, and even love are not abstract ideals. They're neurophysiological states. The human connection isn't symbolic, it's electromagnetic. That discovery shifted everything for me. I stopped trying to build from isolation. I started working with teams, not just intellectually, but energetically. Meetings became less about ideas and more about coherence, how aligned, calm, and attuned we were before solving a problem. And the results were astonishing. Creativity surged, conflict dropped, efficiency rose, not because of new strategies, but because of new states of mind. The irony is that I had to collapse to understand the true nature of strength. We've built a world that rewards acceleration, but evolution rewards regulation. It's not the strongest organism that survives, nor the fastest. It's the most adaptable. And adaptability depends on the nervous system's flexibility, not its tension. So now when I stand on this stage, I don't see my hospitalization as a failure. I see it as an initiation into a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. We are not meant to live in constant fight or flight. Our biology was designed for cycles, intensity followed by integration, effort followed by ease, expansion followed by rest. The universe itself breathes that way. Expansion and contraction, light and dark, energy and stillness. To live in constant acceleration is to live against the universe's rhythm. I often get asked, how do we restore that rhythm in a world that never stops? My answer is deceptively simple. We begin by stopping, by pausing long enough to remember that we are not separate from our bodies, not separate from each other, not separate from the living intelligence that sustains everything. Science calls it homeostasis. I call it harmony. You don't have to end up in a hospital to learn this. You don't have to crash to remember your limits. You just have to listen to your body, your breath, your silence. Because every signal, every ache, every sigh is your nervous system trying to bring you back to coherence. The greatest discovery of my life wasn't in a lab or under a microscope. It happened when I stopped thinking and started feeling. It happened when I realized that intelligence without balance is just a beautiful form of self-destruction. So to everyone listening, take this as both a warning and a gift. The warning is that you are not invincible. The gift is that you don't need to be. The human brain, when in harmony with the body, is capable of unimaginable clarity, compassion, and creativity. You don't have to break to become brilliant. You just have to breathe, because sometimes the only way forward is to finally stop running